I could do that. I don't. No, they did a great job. It was pretty amazing. Yep. Well, it is Christmas season here at The Journey, and we are glad that you are with us this morning. Real quick, I want to hit a few things for you. Do not forget your Christmas wishes for Koinonia, and the jackets and coats are due today. Some of you are like, oh man, I forgot. You got to about 1 o'clock to go get those after you leave and come back. We'll be here till then. There will be some people here this evening. There's a teen event that is taking place. So you can drop them off this evening. Just don't bother the teens as they're doing their thing this evening. But don't forget to finish bringing those in. If you need to do that later on this week, sorry. You got to figure that out yourself, okay? But no, we're glad that see all the help that we're giving to our community. The other thing is, I'm not sure if these got on the seats for this time around. Hopefully they did. But we have our Christmas Eve services that are coming up on December 24th at 2, 3:30, and 5 p.m. here in this space. We want you to come, be a part of it, but we want you to invite people to come with you. And that's why we have these cards. You can take it home if you need it to remind you. But this is also a great way to go up to somebody like, hey, I want you to come hang out with me for a little bit on Christmas Eve. It's the number one service people will show up for if you invite them to come. It is Christmas Eve. So do that. Even if you go to a restaurant somewhere, you take 1 or 2 of these, you leave it there. Leave a really nice tip so they actually would want to come if the waiter or waitress sees this. But we're asking you to invite people to join us for Christmas Eve. And then lastly, or actually a couple things, Christmas Eve opportunities. We are looking for people to jump in and volunteer on Christmas Eve. We don't need a ton of people, but we definitely need some volunteers to jump in. So if you're going to be here, let us know. You can sign up through the app. You can sign up through the QR code in front of you. And then lastly, our Christmas offering. Don't forget, our goal is $30,000 for this year. Part of that's going to our Generosity Feeds event that's taking place in March. And then the rest of that is going to phase 2 of our playground. So some great things happening there. I'm not going to go into all the details. If you get our weekly email, you've had a chance to read that. Again, through the app that you have, and then hopefully you have, and then the QR code, you can get more information. But love this time of year here at The Journey. Speaking of Christmas, there's a boy named Benjamin who wants a baby sister for Christmas. And so he goes to the table, and he's got some paper and a pencil, and he's just signing like, I'm going to go to the top. And so he starts writing this letter to God. Dear God, I've been a really good boy this year. And he looks at what he wrote, and he's like, that's a lie, and God's not going to believe this lie. So he crumbles up his paper, he throws it away. He goes to another piece of paper, starts to write again, and he's like, Dear God, I've been a pretty good boy this year. He looks at what he wrote, and he said, yeah, God's not going to believe that either. And so he crumples it up, and he throws it away. Benjamin sits there at the table for a little bit and decides, I think I got a plan. He goes to the bathroom, grabs a towel, goes to the family room where the nativity scene is. He grabs Mary. He shoots up into his bedroom, slams his door. He takes Mary, puts her in this towel, wraps her up, puts her as deep as he can underneath his bed. And then he jumps on the bed and begins to write this new letter. And it says, Dear Jesus, if you ever want to see your mother again. Like most of us, that's the way we live our lives anyway, right? We're like Benjamin. Like we can't wait, right? We can't wait. And so we were trying to take matters into our own hands. And we do this because waiting is so hard for us. So what do we do in the waiting? When that promotion never seems to be coming, when that relationship never seems to be mending, when that sickness never seems to be healing, or that reconciliation never seems to be happening, what do we do in the waiting of life? And so that's been our focus in the series that we have been in called Waiting Room. We've been talking about what it's like to wait. So if you haven't been here, let me give you a little recap. If you've been here, this is a recap too for you. But the first week, we talked about Abraham. There's this guy named Abraham. God comes to Abraham, makes this promise to Abraham. And that promise is that all people will be blessed through Abraham. And so this is connected to the Israelites waiting on this Messiah. It's connected to, for us, for all humanity, that Messiah being Jesus. And so there's this promise that is made. We talked about that the first week. Last week, we talked about the promise again, but we also talked about these prophecies. We said they had the promise, Israelites had the promise, but they had these prophecies that they were looking for to come true. And so they were waiting for the Messiah to come who was going to fulfill all of these different prophecies. 2,100 years pass from the time Abraham gets this promise till the time Jesus is born. But for the first 1,700 years, the Israelites heard from God. Like God communicated with them through the prophets that were there. For 400 years, there's silence. They don't hear anything from God. Think about those generations. Here we have in those 400 years, generation after generation after generation who never hear a word from God. They're still living their lives. They're still brothers and sisters and moms and dads. They're still having work to do, and they're trying to put food on the table. And so they're doing everything that they normally do. And at the same time, like I said last week, in this 400 years, the Persians come through, the Greeks come through, the Romans come through. So they're getting beat up like crazy. This is a tough time for them to live. And yet their whole life, they've heard about how incredible God is and how amazing God is and all these wonderful things that God has done. And yet they have never had a chance to actually experience any of this. They've been told their whole lives about this wonderful, incredible, amazing God. Now, they still have the promise and they still have these prophecies, but you got to imagine when there's no prophets and no prophecies and God's not sending text messages and emails and letters to them, all there's silence. You got to imagine they're starting to lose hope. Like they're starting to wonder and ask questions about the reality of God. And I bet this probably sounds familiar to many of us too. Like we've heard how great God is, how amazing God is, and all these incredible things that God has done, and how God heals and does these miracles, and how God is so wonderful. And we're like, that sounds great, but I haven't experienced that in my own life. My marriage is still broken. My relationship with my dad is still non-existent. I can't get over the death of this close friend. This divorce is killing me. I'm struggling to pay my bills. I'm still not getting pregnant. And I keep praying to God, and I keep asking for guidance, and I keep asking for God to jump in and do something. But all I'm getting is silence. So what do we do in the silence? What do we do in the waiting? And that's the question we're going to answer today. Now, we're going to spend our time this morning, all of our time in Luke chapter 1, looking at a story here. Luke is a biography of the life of Jesus. And at the very beginning, he gives us this really interesting story, I think. Luke chapter 1, starting with verse 5, it says, when Herod was king of Judea, there was a Jewish priest named Zechariah. He was a member of the priestly order of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all the Lord's commandments and regulations. The story begins, we're introduced to this couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth. We learn that Zechariah is a priest and that Elizabeth comes from a priestly line. This was a pretty big deal for these two to get married. You didn't have to do that in those days, but for a priest to marry the daughter of a priest really kind of made them this power couple. And so we got this power couple, and what do we read? They're very committed to their faith, and they're very committed to serving God. Even in this, there's this struggle that they have. Verse 7, they had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they both were very old. Power couple from really good families. They've got a strong faith. They're God followers. And we get two really important pieces of information right here. We find out that she's not able to conceive, and both of them are very old. Now, in that culture, there would have been a lot of questions flying around about Zechariah and Elizabeth. Because you have these very faithful servants. They come from deeply religious families. They're strong God followers. And so the expectation would be God would be blessing them with all kinds of kids. So why aren't they able to have kids? Well, in that culture, it was thought that this was God's punishment for you. That more than likely you, Zechariah and Elizabeth, that you had sinned in such a way God was punishing you. Or that someone in your family at some point in time had sinned in such a way that God was punishing you for the sins of your family. Kind of think about trying to carry that kind of burden and pain. But yet they did this every day. Look at verse 8. One day Zechariah was serving God in the temple, for his order was on duty that week. As was the custom of the priest, he was chosen by lot to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. While the incense was being burned, a great crowd stood outside praying. Priests in those days only came from one tribe. They came from the tribe of the Levites. And over that time, that would have meant there were a lot of priests. In fact, there were so many priests, King David, generations before our story here, actually breaks the priests into 24 divisions, okay? This is how many priests there are. Well, it's thought that at the time of Jesus, there were probably around 18,000 priests that were alive and working. Well, as priests, you had your normal day-to-day duties where you worked where you lived. It was kind of like a local church pastor, right? That you just worked where you lived. But where you really wanted to be was the temple. The temple was the place that you wanted to be. Well, you got a couple of chances every single year to do that. 3 times a year, all the priests would show up there in Jerusalem at the temple, and your job was just to serve around the temple. There were 3 big festivals that happened at that time. The priests would come in because there were so many Jewish pilgrims that were there. The population of Jerusalem would swell to such an amount that they would just help around the temple in many different ways. But 2 weeks a year, your division got to come to the temple to do rituals and sacrifices. But there's a problem. There's only one temple, and there's way too many priests to fulfill all of these different rituals and sacrifices that needed to be done. And so it was possible that throughout your life, you would never get a chance to actually serve in the temple. So how did they figure out who got a chance to do this? They would cast lots. We're not really sure what these lots were like. What we think they were dice. And they would roll these dice and like, hey, is Priest Zechariah going to get a chance to do these rituals? And they'd roll the dice, and if it popped yes, then he would get this chance to do that. I kind of imagine for Zechariah, like he's sitting there waiting, and you guys remember Price is Right? It was probably like, all right, Johnny, who's the next priest who gets to work in the holy place of the temple? Well, Bob, Priest Zechariah, come on down. You're the next priest to carry out temple duties. I kind of imagine that's probably not exactly like it was, but this is a big deal for Zechariah, okay? He is old. Like he's at the age of where he is probably getting ready to retire from the priesthood. There was an age where you had to do that. He's been waiting for this his whole life. So this is huge for him. Because again, some priests spent their whole life and never got a chance to do any of these rituals or sacrifices. So he's excited. I don't know what priests did, if they chest bumped, high-fived, whatever. But he's got this job to do. What's his job to do? Well, twice a day, people would show up at the temple to pray. It was the morning and afternoon. That was 9 and 3 p.m. Scholars think it was the 3 p.m. time period that he was chosen to do this. And if you know much about the New Testament, you know that there's connections to those time periods for prayer at the temple. But anyway, there's a big crowd there. His job is to go into this holy place of the temple. I think we have an image of that. Yeah. So if you look at this image here, this is what the holy place would have looked like. There's a menorah there on the left. In the middle, on the right side, it was this bread that they would change every week. And then the little thing down towards the bottom, that was the altar for the incense. And so his job was to go in there to light this incense as this aroma to God, or the prayers of the Israelites to God. And his job was to go in there and to actually pray too. Verse 11. While Zechariah was in the sanctuary, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the incense altar. Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah." Here's Zechariah, who is in this room all by himself. It's not well lit. The only light is coming from that menorah that you saw there in that image. And the next thing you know, this angel shows up in this place. Got a question for you. How would you respond to an angel showing up like this? Would you A, faint, B, scream like a little kid and run, C, lose all control of bodily functions, or D, throw a punch at the angel? I think honestly I'd do all 4 at the same time, right? I mean, this guy is afraid of what's happening here. In fact, the words we see here, shaken and overwhelmed, are pretty soft. The word that's actually used here means terrified. He is absolutely scared of what he's experiencing in this holy place. And what's the angel of the Lord say? Don't be afraid. Like that's going to make the terrified nature of him feel any better by hearing those words, right? Well, the angel's actually not done. Look at verse 13. God has heard your prayer. Your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John. There's a question I have when I read this passage every single time, like, which prayer is God answering here? Is it the prayer that Zechariah and Elizabeth have had about having this child, or is it the prayer that all these priests have been praying all of these years as they would come in and they would light this incense on this altar? Is this prayer that this Messiah would come? Which prayer is being answered? Because here's Zechariah coming in, lighting this offering on this altar, and he is praying the prayers that have been prayed for centuries, but at the same time in this space where he's the only one in there and it's quiet, does he lift up a prayer to God and say, hey God, don't forget about Elizabeth and me and this prayer we've been praying for decades? Now, we don't know, all right? I mean, we kind of look at this passage and think, I think that he could be answering both prayers here. That here is God who is saying through this angel, Zechariah, I'm going to answer all the prayers that the Israelites have been praying for 2,100 years right now in this moment. And at the same time, I'm going to answer this prayer that you and Elizabeth have had for decades. What does the angel say? Verse 14. You will have great joy and gladness. Many will rejoice in his birth, for he will be great in the eyes of the Lord. He must never touch wine or other alcoholic drinks. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth, and he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. He will be a man with the spirit and power of Elijah. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and he will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly. Here's Zechariah, who's told that after all of the waiting, and even I think after all the silence from God and all the prayers, the son is coming. Now, this kid's not the Messiah, right? This kid is going to be named John. John's job is going to be to prepare the way for the Messiah to come, to prepare the way for Jesus. And how does Zechariah respond to this great news? Verse 18, Zechariah says, how? How can I be sure this will happen? I'm an old man now, and my wife is also well along in years. Notice that word, how. He doesn't say, thank you for these great tidings that bring great joy and gladness to my heart and my soul because you were answering this prayer. That's not what he says. He's like, angel, do you understand how things work on earth? Because apparently you don't, right? Like physically, we can't do this. We've tried, and it's not working. It's not happening. Something is broken here. How are you going to do this? There's this doubt in Zechariah's response. This angel says this is going to take place. And here is Zechariah saying, yeah, I'm not real sure about this. I know we've been waiting. I know there's been silence from God. But how are you going to make this happen? How is God going to do this? And you're probably, some of us are not any different than Zechariah. Like we've been waiting and waiting and waiting for God to do something, to move, to act, and we get to this point of saying, God, I hear all these things about you and how great you are and how wonderful you are and these miracles you have done. So how are you going to do this thing in my life that I'm asking you to do? God, I know you want to mend the brokenness in my family, but how? God, I know you want to help me through this addiction, but how? God, I know you want to heal my marriage, but how? God, I know you want to give us kids, but how? And like Israelites and Zechariah and Elizabeth, again, we ask how. God, I've heard these great things. I've heard about your power, but I'm praying, I'm hoping, I have this desire for this thing to come true, for my life to be better, but I'm not seeing it. I'm not experiencing it. So can you tell me how you're going to make this happen? The reality is sometimes God doesn't work quite the way that we think God is going to work. Look at verse 19. Then the angel said, I am Gabriel. I stand in the very presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you this good news. But now, since you didn't believe what I said, you will be silent and unable to speak until the child is born. For my words will certainly be fulfilled at the proper time. What do you notice here? Here's Zechariah who says, hey, God, how are you going to do this? And what's God's answer? Well, I'm actually going to make your life a little bit harder. Not quite the answer we would expect, right? I think about it. I'm going to go ahead and give away part of the story. Elizabeth gets pregnant and the son is coming. And for 9 months, Zechariah is not able to speak. I would say that makes life harder. And you and I are sitting here thinking, wait, hold up a second. There's this thing I've been praying about and I've been waiting on, and the thing God's going to do, God's going to make my life harder. Is it harder because God makes life harder, or is it harder because of the doubt that you and I have? That our doubts towards God may lead to more waiting. Our doubts towards God may lead to this silence. And what God's really looking for is to see if you and I can trust him fully. In that wait, while we work through the doubt and trying to find this trust, well, it does. It makes life feel a little bit harder. And all God's saying is, hey, can you fully trust me? And so Zechariah is here. He asks this question. He's, how? How are you going to do this? Maybe the question we should be asking, though, is why? Hey, God, why are you silent right now? God, I've been praying for this for years or decades. God, I've been waiting on you to answer this prayer. God, I've been looking for guidance and help, and all I'm experiencing is nothing but silence. Why? Look, I don't know why your prodigal son hasn't come home yet, but because I know you're ready to love them. I don't know why God hasn't given you that child, because I know that you will be a great parent. I don't know why God hasn't healed your body, because I know you have so much to offer people. I don't know why God hasn't given you a spouse yet, because I believe you would be a great husband, you would be a great wife. I don't know why God is silent in your waiting, because I can tell you this, I know and believe that God has heard your prayers. But it leaves us with that question of why? Why? Why are you silent, God? Maybe it's not that God is being silent. Maybe it's this trust factor. And also, could be that God has a plan for our life, and it's just not time for the fulfillment of that plan. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, Paul writes these words, "But when the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law." That phrase we see there, that right time came, is the same word as a pregnancy coming to full term. So when God sends Jesus to the earth, it was at the exact right moment. Okay? Israel's been waiting on this Messiah for about 2,100 years. Humanity's been waiting for this Messiah too. And at the exact right time, which was God's timing, by the way, and not humanity's timing, when everything had come to full term for God, what does God do? God sends Jesus. I believe God has a plan for our lives too. Like the main thing for God's plan for our life is that we follow Jesus. That we are called to fully follow Jesus. And maybe for some of us, it's that first step that we've got to take. And I know we talk about this a lot here because we believe it's a big part of our spiritual journey, that baptism is one of those first things that we do when we say, hey, I am all in. God's plan is for us to fully follow Jesus, and the first step that we can take is that step of baptism. And so maybe you got questions of baptism, or you want to be baptized. There's a QR code in front of you. If you go down that link tree, there's a baptism button there. You hit that, and that gets to Joel, and we love to talk to you guys about what baptism is like and why it's important. But it's a part of the spiritual journey where you and I are saying, hey, I am fully in to following Jesus. And if we're fully into following Jesus, then we believe that God wants the best for us. And if God wants the best for us, then we're going to trust that whatever happens in our lives, that God is present in the midst of that, even in the waiting, even in the silence. But when the right time comes, in God's timing, God will bring that plan to fruition for us. But again, it takes that trust in God to move forward. Look at verse 21. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah to come out of the sanctuary, wondering why he was taking so long. When he finally did come out, he couldn't speak to them. Then they realized from his gestures and his silence that he must have seen a vision in the sanctuary. Zechariah goes in. He's been in there longer than there was the norm, right? They've got these rhythms, and so they know how long this should have taken. He's in there a long time. They're wondering if he's okay. He finally comes out, and he can't say a word to them. And I don't know if he does temple charades or what they do there, but he does something, and they notice, like, oh my goodness, he has seen something incredible. He has seen and experienced something absolutely amazing. And so they're trying to figure all of this out with him about this vision that he sees in the sanctuary. Look at verse 23. When Zechariah's week of service in the temple was over, he returned home. Dude is hardcore. I don't know about you. If I had that experience, I'd be like, I'm out. I'm going to go home, right? He's like, no, however he did it. I'm going to finish up my week of work here at the temple, and then I go home. So he goes home to Elizabeth. Verse 24, soon afterward, his wife, Elizabeth, became pregnant and went into seclusion for 5 months. You got to understand, this child that they're going to have is not from the Holy Spirit, okay? That happened with Jesus, with Mary. And so Zechariah goes home to Elizabeth, and they got to be intimate, and so they're intimate, and she becomes pregnant. But it's kind of strange here that they put this last piece about the seclusion for 5 months. Until you kind of think about it, it's one thing to say you're pregnant, and she could have said that because she knew it, right? I'm pregnant, but people would have looked at her and like, I don't think you can be pregnant, and I don't see that. So waiting 5 months gets you to this point of, as scholars would said, like, hey, she'd probably have a baby bump at that point. And she could walk around and people could see that and like, oh, there has been a miracle. That Zechariah and Elizabeth are pregnant and this child is to come. Verse 25, look at what she says. She said, how kind the Lord is. In the end, these years of waiting are over. John is born. Zechariah can speak again. We read that a little bit further down. Life is good for them. This miracle has been fulfilled. They have this kid. I mean, God is good. And so this kindness that Elizabeth is talking about, this is the kindness that she's experiencing from God because these prayers have finally been answered. And she and Zechariah have this son, John. But she really has no idea of the kindness to come. And I wonder sometimes, do we really understand the kindness of God ourselves? Because what we tend to do is when we have these struggles and we have this pain and we have this hurt, we tend to focus on it. It becomes our life. It takes over our life, whatever that may be: sickness, infertility, addiction, broken relationships, mental struggles, the job that hasn't come, the special person who hasn't shown up in our life, the parent who is distant, the child who hasn't come back. And please hear me. I'm not saying those things are not important and that they shouldn't be a part of what we focus on in our lives. But in the midst of the struggles that we are facing, do we realize the kindness of God? Meaning, do you take time to look around you and to see how God has blessed you? That maybe when God seems silent, instead of being stuck in a pit, we talked about that last week, maybe it's time to focus on the kindness of God. how God has already worked in our lives, how God has blessed us in incredible ways, how God has answered those other prayers that we've had. But too often, we're Benjamin, right? We're Benjamin, where we don't like to wait, we don't like the silence, and so we're trying to take matters into our own hands. We're trying to get God to work in our plan, in our timing, and yet we forget about the kindness of God. We forget about who God is and what God has done and this kindness that is all around us. Well, how do we know that we can find ourselves focused on the kindness of God? Let me share with you a couple of things as I finish up this morning that I think are powerful ways to do that. The first one is be grateful. We did our Monday series a few weeks back, and a lady walks out, and we're talking about the series, and she's talking about generosity, and she tells me, she's like, you know what, Joel preached a sermon not too long ago, and he was talking about being grateful, and she's like, I still do this every day. Joel said, it's a great next step. He said, every morning you wake up, write down 3 things you're grateful for. And it can't be the same thing. That every day it's totally something different. But 3 things you're grateful for every time you wake up in the morning. She's like, it has changed the way I view my life. It has changed who I am. It's changed my faith. But I think that's true for us, that if we can focus on those things that we are grateful for, that we can be thankful for, it can really begin to change how we view our lives. And I believe we can really begin to see the kindness of God in our lives too. What are you grateful for? Maybe we start our days writing down those things that we're thankful for. Not how, God, how are you going to fix this? Or, God, why are you silent? But we're saying, hey, God, thank you for this in my life. Start with be grateful. Second thing I would say is be prayerful. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. I took this and looked at different translations of this verse. Here's what we have. Pray continually. Never stop praying. Pray without ceasing. Pray constantly. As I look at all those different translations of that verse, I begin to think about what we're talking about. So maybe this will help us. When God seems silent, pray continually. When God doesn't seem to be working, never stop praying. When things seem harder, pray without ceasing. When you don't know the answer to how, pray constantly. When you can't figure out why God is silent, don't stop praying. Be prayerful in the waiting and in the silence. Israel prayed for 2,100 years. Finally, God answers that prayer. Zechariah and Elizabeth pray for decades, and God answers that prayer. I believe God wants to answer our prayers, but are we praying even in the midst of the tensions and struggles that we're in? Be prayerful. And then lastly, I would say this: when God seems silent, let this story remind you of the kindness of God. I sometimes forget about this story with Zechariah and Elizabeth, or just kind of blow over it pretty quickly. But there's kindness here, right? There's the birth of John. And what does John do? John prepares the way for Jesus. He sets the stage for Jesus to come. And so through the birth of Jesus, you know what we see? We see the kindness of God. But again, Elizabeth didn't see the kindness to come. Part of that was the birth of Jesus, but I would even take it a step further. Where the real kindness is, loving kindness, was there on the cross. That here's God who's willing to send his son to this earth, Jesus, not just to live some life and just to kind of die at some old age. No, to live his life so that at some point in time, he would be betrayed and he would be crucified. Like, that is loving kindness at its height. And you and I get to experience that kindness in our lives. It gives us, I believe, something to hold on to. And it's not just that death, it's the resurrection of Jesus. That when the answers don't seem to be coming, here through the cross, we see the loving kindness of Jesus, or of God. Maybe through the story, we can see the kindness of God in our waiting, and in the silence.